the floor is open for questions. Yes, Lynn.
Hi. Again, thank you both for very fascinating uh, presentations. So I have two things. One, I would love to hear you in a way, both of you think together, bringing together the screen and repair. So one question, just, kind of that I thought of through a totally, in a way, trivial, very trivial example, but the way that people are often attempting to repair their screens, literally, like the way, again, all these surfaces through which we screen things break, and now there's like a business, of course, in repairing them. But I think that, even as a trivial example, raises bigger questions about, even for example, Jinying, in your presentation, the way that like the Great Firewall of China is constantly kind of broken into, right? Or things get through it, and then they attempt to repair it, meaning close out any kind, you have that image of like the tweet flying over the wall or things breaking through the wall, but then it's repaired so that the wall can seem again like the sovereign unbreakable enclosure. So I think that really goes to your really important point, Avishek, about how repair, can work just as much to maintain the status quo as to do anything sort of different. So I'm curious about that. Now, of course, there also is the sort of beautiful tradition, I realize this is Japanese, not Chinese, of wabi-sabi, of where you repair something precisely to call attention to where it was broken and not try to hide that. So literally kind of repair certain screens in a way that is seen as enhancing their beauty by showing where it was broken. So again, I think that relationship between what does it mean to repair screens in today's world, is one I posed to both of you. So that's one question I had. And then a second one for Jinying. I was really struck with the way you talk about the both enclosing barrier and the display surface as two primal scenes of the wall. And I'd love to hear you talk more about the notion of how they function as primal scenes in the sense of fantasies, how they're certain both, sort of, bringing up the kind of Freudian notion of the primal scene. What does it mean to describe them as primal scenes? So I realize those were two quite different questions, but, those would be mine. So thank you.
Okay, Avishek. Avishek.
Yes. Hi. Hi, Adi. Did you want me to go first, or Jinying, did you want to go?
You can go first.
Yeah.
Well, it's thank you, Lynn. It's always fascinating to see, how the presentations seem to come together or speak to each other, and how it really comes together in the audience. I was taking some notes listening to your presentation. I was kind of trying to see where this speaks. Repairing screens was not one of those. I did think of the idea of translation. I did think of how both the repair and the screen and the wall, both of these seem to exist in the modality of both and, as both barrier and surface, or neither nor. So those were some of the things I was thinking, and of course the performativity of this. But repairing screens, what I find fascinating in actually having had to repair a broken screen on a phone is that, if you do not, if you don't replace it, right? If you get that, the showing of the repair, the mark of repair is very, I think is very important, as you said, right? So this, this quotation, because it's, said so much more beautifully than I could, feeling through the brokenness, which is from the work of this artist that I mentioned, at the German Pavilion and the Venice Biennale. The idea of letting it show is it's kind of that which reminds us that, so that, that for me was important to bring in, so that it, we don't adapt too quickly and unproblematically the idea of repair as a solution. I'm really wary of that instrumentality. I understand the desire and the need. I also understand the disciplinary formations where solving things is important, or is one of the things. I know in the humanities, we do things very differently. if we do, that is, interested in solving. So I think the repair, that showing of that in the repair of a screen, for me, very kind of literally speaking, is a reminder of that, you don't think you've replaced and you've overcome. That could be, that's too quick, too much of a quick fix, even though there is a desire for that in the short term. But, it is a paving over, a covering over a crack, which, is kind of, makes it work, but is haunted in a productive way, I think, by the fact that it was broken. Right? I think it keeps us and it keeps us on our, ethical toes in some sense. I don't know if that makes sense, or Jinying, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question on repair, especially as somebody who constantly dropping my phones. That's something relatable. And what I find also most interesting about the repair, because I constantly talk about walls collapsing in my stories, I'm like, that those walls need to be repaired. So what I find most interesting about the most significant moment of repair, both the wall and the screen, is it signifies vulnerability. When a wall or a screen is vulnerable, it's no longer absolute. So I did ask what makes the wall most politically dangerous is when it's most absolute. But when it's vulnerable, that need repair, it's no longer absolute for wall and the screen. For example, the absolute screen will be film screen that is in the theater that's dark. You're not supposed to touch it. You're not even supposed to talk, right? That's not the screen you repair. But cell phone screen is different. You can carry anywhere. So the touchable screen make it, of course, vulnerable, but also make it actually less absolute. So I used to remember I say, the screen is absolute. You are not supposed to touch it. My student reminds me, my screen is constantly touchable. That reminds me how my understanding of screen, because through this political meaning of the wall, tend to aligning with this absolute power of the wall, but forgot about the tangibility and the vulnerability of the touching screen and the touching wall. So therefore, in my story, I think by going back to this, I do remember when I began this project, I often think of Cheng in coding, when it's supposed to be more absolute, more politically suppressive. However, when I read the story of original how Cheng coming from, I find it's more vulnerable and it's more open, more inclusive, as the story of Meng Jiang tells us, versus the screen, which seems to be softer, the screen of the painting, but yet it tends to be sometimes more absurd as the screen that actually behind the emperor. So that's why I think, indeed, I also want to emphasize another thing, the repair versus defend. The Great Firewall, a lot of the time, they're not really repair, they're defensive, they're preemptive, like a preemptive strike. So I want to emphasize, I think the value of the repair versus defend is military and preemptive. That's defending the absoluteness of the wall or the screen. So therefore, I think we need to thinking about what is the condition for repair and what is condition asking for defend. And the defend also reminds me of the earlier panel about the aerial strike and how those killing of the civilians was often justified by the notion of defend. But defend sometimes is undefensible, because it is defending something that's very absolute and very politically oppressive. So I want to asking whether or not we can changing our political notion from defend to repair, and thinking about how defend is sometimes unjustifiable rather than repair. So and the third, coming back to Lynne's question about the two primal, again, I borrow from Francis Cassidy. So the primal, for one thing, is to say it's not to argue for primal, first argue against a temporal argument of a like a precondition, preconfiguration, because I don't think there's a historical order what had happened before and earlier. Primacy means it's always there, and I mean in our desire to certain hoping or desiring the world to be a certain way, but not necessarily. For example, we may desire the world to be a communal cohesion, even if it may not function that way. So I think that's something I want to emphasize, the primal. So that's why I want to emphasize the primal, not this, not really the, in my paper, I think maybe I said it not clearly, the surface and the barrier are the condition, but the primal are not this two. The primal are the Cheng and the Ping, which are different configuration of this two. So the Cheng is both a barrier and the surface, but configured in a certain way, the softness of the surface coming to the front, so it's more vulnerable, it constantly collapse, versus in the Ping, interestingly, the barrier comes to the surface, even though it's soft, but the barrier is more absolute because it's behind the emperor. So I want to emphasize that both primal thing is a configuration of both the surface and the barrier. It's just different configuration to articulate different desire. One is a desire to be inclusive and cohesion, the other to desire of a sovereign. So I think that's probably what I want to emphasize the primal, which means it's a tendency of what we interpret them from today's perspective, but not what actually chronologically happened before what today have the war. So that seems something I want to emphasize. Okay.
Thank you. Masako, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. It kind of inspires me a lot. These talks have been extremely imaginative, and I deal with numbers. So I'm really kind of glad that I'm attending this conference, and it's a lot of stimulation, a lot, too much perhaps. I have a general, when I was hearing repair, and Avishek, you talked about repair in conjunction in relationship to translation and reparation, and so I was actually sort of under the impression that the repair can be like the opposite, sort of at the opposite pole of the wall, that it would remove the barrier. But you mentioned that reparation, for example, cannot be perfect. And I think I kind of think about the subcategory of this irreparable kind of repairing or restoration of the past. If we kind of go, like move this concept into temporal sort of historical context, then I'm not talking about the historical incidents, but also like the forgery of manuscripts from the past, and it, you kind of say that these were restored and discovered, and this kind of like sort of goes in a different direction, and it goes to the extreme. And I'm not too sure if this is really like removing the barrier. I think it's the opposite. I think it would, in this case, the forgery, manuscript forgery, would be something like establishing the national identity, related to the historical past. And so you are actually building a wall in a way. So I thought that I saw this kind of cyclic kind of image of repair and wall. They're not really like two opposite poles, but they're kind of like going in a circle. And I have a question for Jinying. You mentioned the community, sort of like the defending a community, and the wall's function is defending the community. And I was kind of thinking in a very sort of a much smaller way, in terms of protecting one's personal privacy and against the public. And this would be something like, you want to be hidden. It's not just defending. I think it's you want to be hidden from the public. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, yes, I think just quickly mentioning about the privacy. I think that was, there was another concept I didn't talk about that, by the way, in the book, that's Chang. The Chang concept in Chinese often means private walls. And it's actually often overlap with the ping, that you put something in front of you to protect privacy. And it often means curtain, right? It means curtain, which is similar to the German origin word for wall, it's like a canvas. It is also mostly for women, protecting the privacy of women. So I mean, another history indeed to thinking about the shielding function of the wall as a screen to providing the privacy, particularly in the gender term. But that kind of privacy, of course, also socially constructed sometimes through men and women, who's private, who's not. So yeah.
I'll just thank you, Masako, for your question. Just a quick, it's fascinating to see again how you were reading this. In terms of restoring, preserving, I'm at this strange moment where I'm trying to really think through and think aloud that on the one hand, being a humanities person, I'm trying to kind of really honor and acknowledge the making impulse in repairing or the remaking. And I do think that I definitely, as someone who's concerned, like many of us here, about, the quote unquote crisis of the humanities, I do think that there is a dialogue that needs to happen there, and something really interesting could come out of that. But then, I am also, long years of training and disciplinary formation is wary of something quickly solving something, the instrumental nature of this. And, again, if it's in the short term, but I do think that, our disciplines work for the long term. So I have, so fixing, restoring is something, remaking is, I have opened myself to the appeal and the necessity of that, particularly, given the world we live in now. But I'm hoping that the deliberative slowness, the long-term nature of humanities type of thinking could, could do something to kind of complicate that impulse to kind of restore and fix, because that's the kind of long-term project. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Tim?
Yes, thank you so much for these papers. I want to ask Avishek a question about the, in a sense, it's about the object of repair and about the status of repair as a concept. I mean, what happens when we conceptualize is often we end up putting a lot of pressure on especially when we conceptualize in a kind of performative way, as is conceptualization of concept imagines. We were hearing about that earlier. It puts a lot of pressure on the empirical quality of a particular term. And I guess I've been thinking a lot about Zachary Singh's notion of insistence in an aside in his paper on counting as. We think about, we can think about counting, but we need to think about it as counting as. And I was thinking about, in relationship to your paper, the equivalent would be repair of. We need to think that the of as important as we do in the repairing. And your theses are conceptualizations. They're very careful and very cautious in a sense around the conceptual status of a term like repair. And I suppose I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about the repair of, and in other words, the kind of contexts, the historical contexts, the political contexts in which one can begin to qualify or construct careful principles around the notion of repair as a political concept. There's a book that just came out, which is called, which maybe you've seen, it's by Patricia Stalker. It's called The Ruse of Repair, and it's very much a critique of the turn to repair as a kind of well, she talks about it as a deeply problematic concept that is bound up with a kind of neoliberal abandonment of radical politics. So all this to say, could you say more, in these very tentative theses that you put forward, could you say more about the context, the object of repair, and how you're thinking about that dimension of the term?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim, for that question. That's kind of, in some sense at the heart of, thinking with and about repair. So, and I won't probably have, a finished answer or anything like that to your question. So, it only helps me to think more, because this is something that I have thought, but I'll think aloud a little bit in the spirit of the question. So, there was a few impulses which kind of started me off on thinking with this. I mean, in the kind of my larger work, I think I have always, it has kind of uneasily sat in a literary department, in a literary studies. I mean, that's been my training, but I've always had a kind of uneasy location in the sense that my work has tried to think, while being trained and working with literary theoretical material, training, think beyond or towards the kind of strictly literary, the strictly textual in some sense, the strictly written in this case. So, performance, for example, just finished writing something, putting together something which, thinks about the notion of translation, but in a much more kind of transmedial performance, in this case, performative way, again, building off, the specific context, but trying to do that. So I think the impulse towards thinking about repair comes from, as I said a little bit in the beginning, of working with as a kind of humanities person in a making context, right? So, which is the context at RISD, and where one needs to make a case for the humanities, not in a kind of abstract way, but really every day in the classroom, in every setting, with in every where one was working with. So I think that. So the most immediate context was to see that repair was a concept or a practice that lived in the design disciplines, in architecture, various kinds of architecture, disciplines, and in a largely strictly kind of making thing, right? That making, remaking, unmaking, and since I've had a kind of itch towards thinking about making for various reasons, for my own training, my own kind of things I grew up with and around, so the impulse was to think specifically intervene in that and kind of see that discourse and think that, well, there's a lot going on under the sign of repair, right? And the making, I wanted to preserve the importance and the primacy of the making impulse, because I was worried about making it again abstract, but bringing to that the kind of ethical, political ways of thinking that we do in the kind of humanities, in the theoretical training. So that's where it is at currently. It's kind of honoring the making aspect of something like repair. As I said, that's why I emphasize the mundaneness of this, fixing things to make things go, broken things, screens, objects, etc. Very unremarkable, very everyday, nothing glamorous or world historical about that, on the one hand, but kind of trying to the feeling, the hunch that there is a lot more there, right, that needs to be teased out. So, and yeah, I'm aware of that, the book that you said, it's just recently came out, I think, of Minnesota, and that's part of the problem too, like that the kind of neoliberal, as I think she calls it, impulse to kind of fix and thereby not even think about any kind of radical transformation, right? Because it's like fixing and going, which is why I said that it's the double-edged sword. It can restore status quo. And most eye-opening for me in some sense was to hear that idea that fascism promises to repair things and make things go back to what they were. So there is it's just like translation. I mean, translation is, cuts both ways. It conquers, it also probably emancipates. So, so it's a kind of intersecting hub of all these, but the immediate context and the impulse was, doing humanities work within a making context and trying to kind of, have a conversation from the hunch that there's a lot more going on, where some of the kind of things that we do can add to the discourse, can kind of enrich it, thicken it a little bit, and in a weird way make it less easily usable, because there are problems with things that are quickly usable and easily fixable. So yeah, as I said, I don't know if this answers, but thank you, because that's something that has definitely been at the back of this. I'd love to talk more with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Zachary.
Thanks. I added a question, a kind of comment for Jinying. It's really, I'm going to ask you, Jinying, if you can help me sort of think my way through something. It's an example, like a case of a walled city that I'm thinking about in relation to the questions that you posed about performance and about sovereignty and the staging of sovereignty at the wall. I'm thinking of the case of the Kowloon walled city. I don't know if you know that it's the Hong Kong walled city that was demolished sometime in the 70s, right? The Jiulong Chenzai. It's its name in Chinese, but I'm not just thinking about the historical site of that walled city, but there's something interesting about how that walled city underwent this amazing medial migration into video games, films, and written narratives long after its demolition. There is something about that I think serves as, in some ways, a corroboration of what you're saying, but also maybe a counterpoint, because the fascination with the space of the Kowloon walled city has to do with a hypermobility. It's not the walls. I mean, there are external walls, but there are many internal walls. The entire space of the Kowloon walled city is designed to stage a kind of hypermobility, to stage the possibility of movement turning into performance, movement turning into gesture and virtuosity and athleticism. What I can think of as an analog or as a parallel might be the way that walls function in urban parkour, right? So walls no longer, it seems like there are more possibilities for action at the site of a wall than simply crying or stopping or looking at what's on the surface. I have a feeling, but this is where I think I need help. I have a feeling that's related to something about the status of the historical site of Kowloon walled city as a sort of site of the included excluded. There is a fascination with the hypercriminality of this space within a fairly well run city-state. It seems to represent something that resists sovereignty, that's not entirely outside of, but that navigates in athletic ways around sovereignty. And I feel like the wall is a symbol for that kind of navigation. So that's what I have.
Thank you so much for this fascinating question. I've been writing a lot of notes. I want to emphasize is by maybe thinking of 3 points. First of all, is when I talk about the walled city, one of the most important thing about this concept is accommodation and habitation. Right? So the city that is livable. So I want to emphasize why the mention of mobilization very fascinating, because movement is not just physical, but also social political. So, and I think the question of the wall is indeed the part both activating physical movement, because think about people living on the wall, normally people from immigrants, laborers who need to constantly go through the wall on a daily basis, the peasants coming to the city. Even historically, the peasants need to come through the wall to sell commodities. So it's people normally living on the margin is the one who most frequently encounter in inhabiting the wall. So that's why I think the physical movement emphasizing the social status of them as the marginal figures, and also maybe the boundary figure between inside and outside. Second is the political movement. Because of their social economic status or political status on the margin, the physical movement can also be the condition of political movement. I'm not familiar with that particular war you talk about in Hong Kong, but I'm thinking this seems to be similar with the Xidan, Xidan Democratic War. It was historically a residential war in the old imperial city of Beijing. This enclosure for the imperial city, but eventually become a mediating space for people advocating democratic message before it was being cracked down in the 1989 Tiananmen movement. So in that sense, originally was regulating the movement of this resident physically, historically, but later become activating of a political movement because people coming to this war want articulating a marginal political messages. And the people who engaging with those wars are often people on the political margin or social margin as well. A lot of working class, for example. So I want to thinking about maybe the inhabiting the wall by the physical moving through it. Maybe there is a momentum of also activating the political movement. I think that's also the possibility I'm thinking. So that's why my understanding of the Great Firewall is very different from other people thinking. I think it's very activating, animating device rather than suppressive. Well, it's all suppressive, of course. It's animating a lot of political activity. I begin to see people who used to be non-political become radically politicized after encountering with the Great Firewall. So I think this movement, both physical and informational, can also be the opportunity to generate momentum for activating the social political movement. So that's why emphasizing the original Cheng in the early message is it is inhabiting, it is a performance, it is about calling for help, right? The woman come there calling for help, just like the marginal figure posting their democratic messages on the Xidan wall is calling for help. So I think maybe another also the war called democratic war during the Hong Kong's umbrella movements, another kind of the war, they call Lanham War, right? So that's kind of the kind of the war I'm thinking that can be mobilizing device because people are actually living there, inhabiting there, rather than just seeing them as a boundary. Thank you so much for this example. I actually want to write it down the name of the war.
Thank you. Leo.
Yes, thank you so much. This question actually is also for Jinying. And I've been really excited by all of the references to theater and performance and performativity in the discussion. I mean, I'm coming from theater studies and performance studies. And I was just really curious in your talk to hear more a little bit about, you know, how you're thinking about the way that, for example, a wall might function as a kind of stage technology that has a degree of both opacity and transparency that's possible. So like the reason that, you know, screens are interesting on stage is that you can put a light behind them and see what's going on behind them, right? And if you put a light in front of it, you can't see what's going on behind it. And so there's something really fascinating about thinking about the sort of theatrical or performative wall in that context. You know, about the sort of wall that, you know, sort of separates you from a space, but that actually sort of frames or shows you what's going on behind it. And so I would just love to hear more about how you, or if you think about that at all. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating question. Actually, I just wanted, there was last year, it was a paper presented in the SEMS panel. One of my panelists is Professor Bao Weihong from UC Berkeley. She is exactly writing about the same issue, the painted screen in the history of Chinese theater. So I think I want to emphasize maybe two elements of it. Historically, in the staging of the theater, there's always some kind of screen behind. There were two functions of it. One of them is practical, right? You need to separate between a space in front of the stage for the performance and also actor actually behind it, so they need to prepare. It's a practical function, but that practical function also has a symbolic function. The separating between a fictional universe, the performance, versus the actual universe of the audience, of the materiality, the people actually preparing for that. So this is actually this kind of the function of separating between the physical space versus the fictional one, exactly the screen you see literally, historically, genealogically developed into a film screen, right? What is on the screen is fictional, what is behind is the technological apparatus. But the third one is in the modern use of the screen, another kind of early, more domestic and mundane function of the wall. And also the screen was introduced that is as a protection against fire, against wind. So in the early modern Chinese theater, they introduced screen also to literally to stop fire. So the screen has a multiple function. It's its traditional function separating between the performance, virtual space versus the physical one, but it also has this practical function of protecting the actor and actress from fire, from hazard, from like a physical danger, just like the actual wall in your house. And think about screen historically also about protecting from fire. And then the early use of the screen before it becomes a film screen, it's a screen to shield yourself from the fire, from the wind, from the hazard. So I think there were three different functions. First is separating the space. Second, the symbolic between real versus virtual. Third, the spatial divides for protecting and the shielding all coming together in this use of a wall screen, I would call it, in the theoretical space.
Thank you. Suzanne, did you raise your hand before?
I had, and I put it down because Tim asked pretty much the same. I mean, it was pretty much my question. So thanks, Tim.
Okay. So I don't see any hand. I will ask a small question. Avishek, for you, thinking about repair, I always start with repair of you know, the objects, simple objects, tools, devices, etc. And I think that one of the features of repair in our time in a neoliberal economy is the fact that we are surrounded by devices that we cannot repair because we are deprived of the right to repair them. How does it fit into your account?
Thank you, Adi, again for that question. I do touch upon that there is ongoing, as you obviously know, that there's ongoing kind of conversation about the quote unquote right to repair, right? And it is and it is kind of really addressing the use and throw economy, the kind of planned obsolescence economy in some sense. It fits into the way I'm thinking about it, repair of objects, with a caution or a corrective that, the notion of a right, as we know, everywhere, but particularly with respect to something like, the act of repairing, may not necessarily encapsulate all the context of repair, all the need for repair, all the situations where repair works. So I think there is something to be said about the rights discourse about it, but it might need supplementing with examples, with situations where the rights may not entirely encapsulate the relationship to repair that let's say people would have, or even the kind of situations where repair is widespread or invoked, which is so it goes into this idea of intellectual property rights, right? That kind of thing, why it's not done. So it opens up, which is where which is why I want to emphasize that repair is in this kind of sense of very mundane objects is much more widespread, probably a much more, has been going on for a long time, and in some sense, quote unquote, illegal in sense of, when it comes to things like, what can be repaired legally and not, as I say, with the notion of intellectual property rights. So it does fit in, but with a corrective that may not be it may not be a capacious enough discourse to account for the large life of repair, in the world, and what I call, kind of tongue-in-cheek, most of the world. So, but yeah, it's definitely there.
I think we are done for today. It was wonderful. Thank you for staying so late in the evening, and we will be here tomorrow at 10:30 as today to hear Juliet Fouquer and Yanis Chamilakis in the first session. Hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you.